every town that dots a map has a special circumstance that accounts for its creation. There are many factors that determine the success of a new city, including the forces of nature and man. In one Caldwell County town, it was the determination of one man that brought it into being. Yet it was nature that challenged the city's right to exist. Though today there is very little to mark the city limits of where Grandin once stood, in the early part of the 20th century, it quickly went from rolling hills to burgeoning city. The town of Grandin was named for its creator, William James Grandin. Originally a banker from Tityute, Pennsylvania, W.J. Grandin began looking for timberland in western North Carolina just after turn of the century. After finding the Buffalo Cove area of Caldwell County already being logged by the Bernhardts of Lenoir, Mr. Grandin sent associate Hartley Hunt from Pennsylvania to investigate acreage in northeastern Caldwell County. Doris Hawkins, still a resident of Grandin, was one of Hartley Hunt's 3 daughters.
He knew about it in 1905 and 6 because he sent my father down here in 1907 to look it over.
So Mr. Grandin began his enterprises. They included the Grandin Lumber Company, a double-band mill to process the timber, and the Watauga and Yadkin River Railroad, a way in which to transport his lumber to market, as well as passengers to and from his town.
In December of 1911, Grandin was granted a charter by the North Carolina legislature to build a railroad. He, at the time, had just purchased 60,000 acres of land from ex-Confederate General Robert Hoke, who owned a lot of timber and who at one time tried to buy what was the Carolina Northwestern around Lenoir. Grandin's plan was to connect his railroad at either Lenoir or North Wilkesboro, build a connection to the railroads there, build a sawmill at the new town of Grandin, and have his own railroad and sawmill operation. Originally, there were 2 routes surveyed, one from Lenoir at a connection on the Carolina Northwestern, which was 15 miles. The second route was 30 miles and began in Wilkesboro. The 30-mile connection was chosen because it had a lot easier grading, it could follow the banks of the Yadkin River, and was overall easier to construct, even though 1 tunnel was needed for its construction.
Grandin amassed a group of men who helped oversee the construction of the railroad, the sawmill, and surrounding village. In addition to Hartley Hunt, H.C. Landon was selected as chief engineer, assigned the job of mapping out and building the railroad.
People along our way would tell him, you shouldn't put it so close to the river. But they said because the river was down and it looked normal, he didn't think it would rise up that much. But when the Yadkin gets out of bounds, it can wash out anything.
In a Yankee tradition of the time, and hard times were still felt between the Southerners and the Northerners at the time, he was warned by the old-timers that the banks would become wet every few years and that he would have to face immense flooding. And he scoffed at the local residents' claims and said that he could stop the river with the heel of his boot if he so intended. But history proved him wrong.
Before history was able to catch up with Grandin, and against the advice of local farmers, construction on the Watauga and Yadkin River Railroad began. Continuing through 1912 and into the spring of 1913, the railroad heralded great things to come for this little community.
The railroad was primarily engaged in construction. They were building the sawmill at the same time. They ordered 2 brand new locomotives from Baldwin. They ordered 3 second-hand passenger cars from the Pennsylvania Railroad. And they started constructing, and ultimately were reaching Grandin, Darby, and Elkville, which were in Watauga and Caldwell counties. So the railroad got off to its start, and it served a lot of small little towns and brought a boom to a lot of the small towns that are there. Business really never took off for the railroad because of nature interfering a lot. And primarily, in addition to lumber, the railroad hauled a lot of chickens, a lot of poultry, and a lot of passengers for the small towns. But again, they weren't population centers, and steam locomotives are very expensive even at the time to operate. And the railroad never did take off financially.
But people did begin to gather in the sawmill town, where the job market was expanding. Workers were needed to cut the logs up near Darby, haul them to Grandin for dressing, then transport the lumber to North Wilkesboro for shipping. Meanwhile, Mr. Grandin was getting some help to build the Watauga and Yadkin River. The use of convict labor hired from the state was a common practice in building railroads in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Up until the late 1900s, or late 19-teens, I should say, convict labor was common practice. It built the Western North Carolina Railroad, which people are familiar as the Southern Railway, which went through Hickory and Newton, Morganton. It was also used to build the Chester and Lenoir narrow gauge, which became the Carolina and Northwestern, and it was also used, of course, for the Grandin line. And it was a source of cheap labor, and the prisoners were very badly kept a lot of time just in open cages, but it was considered humane for the time. And in Grandin's particular case, convict camps were established every 4 miles along the route of the railroad in its construction. The practice was basically outlawed by the mid-1920s.
Marie and Reba Huntley remembered that their father, Mr. Charles Preston Huntley, came to the area as a guard, watching over the railroad's convict labor, and eventually became night watchman for the Grandin Lumber Company.
He was a guard for convicts. That's all he ever done in his life till he moved to Grandin. He guarded convicts at the state penitentiary at Raleigh, my daddy did.
I believe he was sent from some other town on out to guard convicts, and he found out about the job in Grandin that was open, and so that's how he got to, we moved to Grandin.
Well, that's where he met Mama. He met Mama on out.
By the spring of 1913, Grandin watched the completion of both the railroad and the sawmill. He also commissioned the construction of buildings around the mill that would come to be known as Grandin. Clara Greer, a resident in the area, kept a diary that recorded the building of the town. She noted the day when Grandin connected with the world. May 3rd. Today will long be remembered by all. The long looked-for train rolled into our quiet little town. This was the work train. May 5th. The train came in with 9 big boilers and 3 flat of smokestacks for the mill. It was a long train for our new road, but it landed them safely. Clara Greer also noted on that same train that Doris Hunt arrived in Grandin with her father.
When we first came, Mr. Grandin said there'd be a house waiting for us. But when we got here, there wasn't a house. There was a fellow Brown who lived in the house next door. So my father had to telegraph Mr. Grandin that there wasn't a house. Mr. Grandin had to go telegraph Mr. Dolliver to be sure that there was a house for him. So then Mr. Brown had to move out so we could move in up there. There were the regular people. The Steeles were regular people, and the Carters, and the Greer sisters, and the Isabels. Now, we didn't have much, the Isabels didn't have much to do with us because we were Yankees, and the people over across from Mariah Chapel were the Frasers, and we didn't have a lot to do with them, or they didn't with us. And then, too, it was uncommon for my cousin to live with us and not being married to my father. So that was quite a talking piece amongst some of the people.
The town of Grandin grew quickly. 32 houses were constructed for the mill and railroad workers. A store was built. A lot was going on in Grandin.
Pretty soon after the railroad was built, there's a level land over across the creek, and a circus came. Well, the people never seen a railroad and never ridden one before. And of course, they never seen a circus before. And then, of course, the thing that happened, the animals got loose, and there was quite a to-do. My cousin, my mother didn't come. I was brought up by a first cousin, so we had to walk the railroad track, the trestle, and then neither one of us were good at walking across water because you felt like you were going down with the water. But anyhow, we got back home quick enough, I guess. We didn't think about it when we got back home. But we did see the circus. I remember a little something about the circus. I don't remember everything that they did, but I remember going to it.
I remember going down there to Hunt's house and Miss Rose Davis a cooking. I know that's the best smelling kitchen I was ever in. I remember that just good as if yesterday. A whole lot better than I can remember things that happened several months ago. And I remember going over to Jim Lackey's. Lackey's lived down there. He was the one that done all the work.
The plumbing.
Yeah, and the work that was to do in Grandin for the houses. He was the one, Jim Lackey was. And I can remember going down to Cal Green's. They lived down under the hill. And we just had a path going down there. And I remember slipping off and going down there. And Mom would give me a whipping for one time for going. And then the next time, she never gave me no whipping for going down there. I'd go down there to play with them girls.
Ball games, that was one of the big things. The boys of the community and the surrounding community would get together and have a ball game team, and the girls would go into the yelling, and that was better back up over there a little ways. The ground was kind of level back there, and close to it was a slave-bearing ground, because the Isabels and the Rears had slaves at one time. And so I remember one of the girls sat on a stone, and she leaned back like you do when you go back to and the snake bit her.
And when gardening time come, I would do all the plowing. I'd have to plow, and I was the same age of that picture there. We had a horse, and I'd do all the plowing and all. And then we had a buggy, and we'd go to church every night and put a lantern on that buggy. And that was about 2 or 3 miles from where we lived there on the hill. And then I'd go to the corn mill and take corn and get hit ground, and we just had a good time down there.
As Grandin grew, so did W.J. Grandin's plans for expansion. His railroad looked for new paths.
The plans were always to connect the Watauga to the Carolina and Northwestern, and also to even go up to Todd above Boone and connect to the Norfolk and Western. That in effect would have made the Watauga route a bridge route and cut several hundred miles off of coal and some other timber, which otherwise would have to go through Knoxville and then through Asheville or down around through Raleigh. And if the line would have been built, it perhaps would have enjoyed a different future than it had.
The Bernards were already had lumber coming out of Buffalo and had a flume, and they came down from Buffalo to the mouth of Buffalo Creek, and then it was hauled into Lenoir. And it was generally thought that the Bernards were against Mr. Grandin doing anything in Lenoir.
But then on a summer's day, July 18th, 1916, fortunes changed for W.J. Grandin and his blossoming city.
A low pressure system came through, which is kind of what we experience day to day, a high pressure or low pressure. A severe low pressure came through, which generally brings rain with it. In addition to that, coming up from the Gulf of Mexico were the remnants of a hurricane. And in 24 hours, over 36 inches of rain hit the area, all at once. The Catawba River at Roadhiss, and if you think of Highway 321 going to Lenoir from Hickory, the Catawba River crested at 55 feet above normal. There are still a couple mills in Roadhiss, and the river was flowing through the second floor of those mills, and those are very, very large mills. The railroads through here, 50% of them were either washed away completely were damaged so badly that they couldn't be used for up to 3 months. Everything was cut off to the north and the south, and at the time roads were very poor, and the railroad really linked town to town. And it was just an immense period of isolation for all of western North Carolina. And it especially hit hard the Watauga route, which had all of its bridges washed out, and even the tunnel that was built around Marley Ford caved in at one end.
The Lenoir News chronicled the disaster in this way. Today, Lenoir is marooned, isolated from the outside world, with no chance of outside communication for several days, and no possibility of train or freight service within 30 days or even longer. Everything on the Catawba River, railroad, bridges, county road bridges, and every avenue of transfer has been swept away. The property loss is staggering, inestimable. Loss of life may also be great. The crew was forced to abandon the train at Ferguson, a stop along the way. Cars were carried down the river, and several, but not all the trestles were washed away. The devastation was immense, but not total. W.J. Grandin attempted to rebuild his railroad, even though the rail service never made money prior to the flood. 1917 saw the rebirth of the Watauga and Yadkin River Railroad, but this time the conditions were different. By April, the United States was involved in its First World War. Also, the resources that originally franchised the Grandin enterprises were less abundant.
He applied for receivership. The railroad hadn't done very well at all. He was going to reorganize, what we would call a Chapter 11. The flood devastated him even more, so it made it a certainty he had to do that. And he did rebuild the line. He rebuilt the trestles, rebuilt the track. Unfortunately, in 1918, another major storm came through. The rails and the bridges weren't built up to spec, and the railroad was again washed away, and the tunnel again collapsed. At the time, Grandin basically gave up and said, "I'm not going to do any more, let's sell the line." Before the sale was completed, he passed away in a car accident.
So they sold it down to about 37,000 acres, and then it was put up for sale at the Carlisle Hotel between Tom Broyhill and Dick Johnson. Tom Broyhill bid 80,000 when the auctioneer told Dick Johnson if he'd make it 90,000, he could have it. So the next day, Dick Johnson did make it 90,000. So he bought the 37,000 acres that was left over.
Slowly, Grandin began to lose its identity as a town. People moved elsewhere in search of jobs. The houses were dismantled for their lumber. But traces do still remain of this once industrial center. The mill still stands, as does the boarding house built in 1911. But most of what Grandin was exists only back then.